The Sumerians were the first people we know of who wrote things down. Their tablets talk about gods called the Anunnaki. They also talk about the end of the world on Earth, and it did not happen just once. Every so often, a catastrophe came for them. Water rose over the fields. Sickness moved through the villages. There were years when no food grew at all, but each disaster left something behind. A few bloodlines were chosen to survive, and they carried everything through to the other side. There are 13 of them. We are going to go through all 13, one at a time, in order. Nobody is in a hurry tonight. You can fall asleep whenever you like. We only know any of this because of a man named George Smith. Smith was not a scholar to begin with. He engraved banknotes for a living, cutting tiny lines into metal plates all day. On his lunch breaks, he walked over to the British Museum and stood in front of the cases of broken clay. That clay had come out of a mound in northern Iraq. It had been dug up, packed into crates, carried across the sea, and then left alone for years, because hardly anyone alive could read it. Smith taught himself to read it. Nobody asked him to. He just kept coming back on his lunch breaks until the marks started making sense. And eventually, the museum noticed and gave him a job. In 1872, he was working through a pile of fragments when he picked up a piece and started reading a story about a man who built a boat. The world was about to be covered in water, and this man had been warned. He took his family aboard. He took animals. Rain fell for days, and afterwards, he sent out birds to see whether any dry land was left. Smith knew that story. Everyone in London knew that story. What he was holding, though, had been written down about 2,000 years before the version he grew up with. The account goes that he became so excited, he started pulling off his clothes in the middle of the room. Whether that is true or somebody's exaggeration, we cannot say for certain, but the tablet was real, and it changed what people thought they knew about how old these stories were. Those crates held a great deal more than one flood. They held king lists, letters, receipts, school exercises, prayers, and long poems about cities that no longer exist. Buried in all of it was a pattern that took decades to notice. Again and again, the Sumerians described their world coming apart, and again, they wrote that certain families were meant to come through. Now, one thing needs saying before we go any further. We are telling you what the clay says. That is a different thing from telling you what happened. Whether these people meant their stories as history or as belief, or as something in between that we do not have a word for, the tablets do not explain. They simply say what they say. 4,000 years later, we are still reading them and still guessing. The first line begins in a city called Aridu. Aridu sat at the southern edge of Mesopotamia, right where the land gave up and turned into marsh. The river went slow there and lost its shape. Waters spread out flat in every direction and grew reeds taller than a person. There was no stone in that country. No forests either, so no timber worth building with. What the people had was mud and reeds, and they got extraordinarily good at using both. Reed houses came first. You cut a bundle of reeds, tie it tight, and stand it up. Bend 2 bundles toward each other, and they make an arch. Line up a row of arches and stretch matting over the top, and now you have a room that stays cool in the heat and dry in the rain. Marsh people in southern Iraq were still building houses that exact way in living memory. Mud brick came later, and mud brick has a problem. It goes soft. After 30 or 40 years, a house starts leaning, and the sensible fix is to knock it flat, spread the rubble out, and build a new house on top of the old one. So that is what they did, over and over, for a very long time. The ground underneath Aridu is made of collapsed houses, stacked on collapsed houses. Archaeologists dug down through that mound and counted the layers. Near the bottom they found a small shrine, one room, nothing special about it. Above it sat a slightly bigger one built on the same spot. Above that a bigger one again. 18 or so layers of temple, each one raised on the wreck of the last, going back to somewhere around 5,400 BC. Nobody moved. That is the thing worth sitting with. For thousands of years, generation after generation looked at the ruin of their parents' house and decided to build in exactly the same place. Those are the reed keepers, and they are the first of the 13. Their whole method was refusing to leave. Everything that comes afterwards in this story depends on them, because every disaster we are going to talk about hit a people who had already decided that leaving was not an option. The Sumerians did not think they built Aridu themselves, though. According to them, the city was handed over, complete, by somebody else, and that somebody had come out of the sea. Picture the marsh at first light. Water lies flat and gray and does not move. Reeds stand up out of it in clumps, and the tops of them are still. Birds are already noisy somewhere off to the left. Everything smells of mud and green stems and yesterday's heat, which has not quite finished leaving. Out of water like that, the Sumerians said, came 7 wise ones. Their name for these figures was the Apkallu, which is usually translated as sages. Sometimes they were drawn as men wearing a fish over their heads and down their backs, like a cloak with the fish's mouth as a hood. Other carvings show them with wings and a bucket. A Babylonian writer named Berossus, working long afterwards for a Greek-speaking audience, described the first of them as a creature that came ashore in the daytime and went back into the sea each night, and he called it Oans. What did the 7 do? They taught. The list of what they taught is basically the list of everything that makes a city work: how to farm land properly, how to build in brick, how to measure and divide and keep records, how to write, how to conduct a temple. Berossus adds that after this teaching, nothing genuinely new was ever invented again, which is a strange and slightly sad thing to claim about your own civilization. Notice what the story is doing. These people had a body of knowledge so old that its beginning was already lost to them. Farming had been going on for thousands of years before anyone thought to write about it. Somebody had to have worked it out, but that somebody was long gone and unrecorded. So the tablets say, the knowledge arrived from outside, out of the water, carried by 7 teachers. Whether that is a memory of something or a way of admitting they had no idea where their own skills came from, the clay does not tell us. Both readings fit. Neither can be tested. What matters for our purposes is what happened next, because the sages did not stay abstract. Real kings, centuries later, put it in writing that they were descended from them. Assyrian rulers claimed Apkallu ancestry directly. Little clay figures of the sages were made and buried under the floors of houses, tucked into the foundations, placed at doorways. The idea was protection. If your family stood in some line of descent from the 7, then the 7 kept an eye on you, and you buried a reminder of that under your own floor where nobody would see it. Sages were also said to have advised specific kings by name, sitting beside the throne, telling the king what to do. 7 names come down to us, though the spellings vary and no 2 lists quite agree. Uana heads most versions, and he is the one Berossus turned into Oans. Others in the group are given as Uanaduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, and Utuabzu, which are difficult names to hold in your head and were probably difficult in their own time as well. A second, shorter set of sages was said to have come after the water went down. Only 4 of those are usually counted, and the texts are careful to say they were partly human, which the earlier 7 were not. Something had been diluted. Whatever the first group had brought ashore was not available in full strength afterwards. One sage story survives at proper length, and it does not end well. Adapa was a priest at Aridu, and one morning he took a boat out to fish, and a sudden gust turned him over. He cursed the south wind for it. His curse worked, which is the point where an ordinary bad day becomes a serious problem, and the wind stopped blowing for a week. Summoned upstairs to explain himself, he was warned by Enki not to accept any food or drink he might be offered, because it would be the food of death. He was offered bread and water at the gate. Following the advice, he refused both. What he had turned down, the text says, was the bread of life and the water of life. Immortality had been sitting on a plate in front of him. The god who warned him either misunderstood the situation or arranged it deliberately, and 4,000 years of readers have argued about which. Adapa went home mortal, and so did everyone descended from him. That claim of descent is our second line. You can be skeptical about it, and most people probably should be. Claiming a divine ancestor is a very ordinary thing for a ruling family to do, and it is a very convenient thing too. but skeptical or not. The claim itself is real, and it lasted. Thousands of years of people insisted on it, buried figures under their floors because of it, and taught their children that the family had come down from something older than the flood. Some of what the seven supposedly taught was counting. Numbers, measures, weights, the tracking of quantities across time. And the first thing the Sumerians decided to count, once they could, was their kings. A scribe sits with a lump of clay in his left hand. He works it until it stops crumbling and holds a shape. Then he flattens it into a pillow, small enough to fit in a palm, and picks up a length of cut reed. The end of that reed is a wedge. Pressing it into the wet surface leaves a small triangular dent, and by pressing at different angles and in different clusters, he can write anything his language can say. Clay dries fast in that country, so he has maybe an hour. Then the tablet hardens, and the writing is fixed. What this particular scribe is copying is a list of kings. The list starts before history and runs forward into names we can check against other records. It opens by saying that kingship came down from the sky and landed in Aridu. Then it starts naming rulers and giving the length of each reign. Alulim ruled Aridu for 28,800 years. After him, Alalngar ruled for 36,000 years. The list moves to a city called Bad Tibira, and the reigns there are longer still. One king is given 43,200 years. Kingship travels on to Larak, then Sippar, then a place called Shurupak. 8 rulers are named across those 5 cities, and the total for all of them comes to something over 240,000 years. Nobody lives that long. The scribes copying this were not stupid, and it is hard to believe they thought otherwise. So what is going on? There are a few honest answers, and none of them is settled. The numbers may belong to a counting system we have not properly decoded, since the Sumerians worked in 60s rather than 10s, and very large figures in that system behave in ways that are easy to misread. The reigns might be symbolic, a formal way of saying this was unimaginably long ago, or the names might not be individuals at all, but families, with each figure covering everyone who ruled from a particular house. We cannot know. The tablet gives numbers and no explanation, and the people who could have explained it died about 4,000 years ago. Then the list does something abrupt. After Shurapak, in the middle of all those enormous reigns, a single short sentence arrives. The flood swept over. Everything before that sentence is measured in tens of thousands of years. Everything after it drops to reigns of a few hundred, then a few dozen, then lengths that look like ordinary human lifetimes. The list carries on into kings we can verify from other sources entirely. One line of text, and the whole shape of the document changes. Our third bloodline is whoever those pre-flood names belong to. Somebody chose them. A scribe, or a chain of scribes over many generations, decided which families were worth keeping and which were not. And the ones that made the cut were remembered for thousands of years by people who had no other reason to know they existed. Everyone else who lived in those 5 cities is simply gone, with no names left at all. One of those 5 cities has left something more personal than a name on a list. Shurupak sat on the Euphrates, and the king list gives its ruler as Ubaratutu, the last man to hold power before the water came. A separate text exists, unrelated to the list, and it takes the form of a father speaking to his son. Copies of it have been found dating to around 2600 BC, which makes it one of the oldest pieces of writing anywhere that was meant to be read rather than counted. The advice in it is startlingly ordinary. Do not put your field on a road, because people will walk across it. Avoid buying a donkey that brays too much. Never vouch for anybody, and if you must, do not vouch for them a second time. A dishonest gain brings no lasting profit. Do not steal, and do not break into a house, and do not commit rape, because you will end up worse off than the person you harmed. Some of it is about how to speak. Keep your mouth measured. Do not answer a quarrel in the moment. A liar with a good manner is more dangerous than an obvious one. Some of it is about money, and it sounds like every generation since. Debt is described as a thing that eats you slowly. Lending to friends is discouraged, on the grounds that you will lose the friend along with the barley. None of this is heroic. Nobody in it fights anything. What makes the text strange is the frame around it. The father giving the advice is named as Shurupak, son of Ubaratutu. His son, the boy being lectured, is named as Ziusudra. That is the man from the boat. So the wisdom text and the flood story are describing the same household, 2 generations of it, one before the water and one during. Whoever put the collection together thought the sensible thing to hand a son was not a prophecy or a warning about the gods, but a long list of practical rules about donkeys and debt and keeping your temper. His son survived the end of the world. Perhaps the donkey advice helped, and perhaps it did not. That is what the 3rd line survived. Not a flood, not a plague, but forgetting. Water is coming, and we will get there. It is not the first thing that came for them, though. Long before the rain started, there was sickness. There is a story called Atrahasis, and it explains why all of this kept happening. The setup goes like this. In the beginning, the gods themselves had to do the work, digging the canals, hauling the mud, keeping the rivers clear. It was miserable, and eventually the ones doing the digging refused to carry on. So people were made instead, specifically to take the shovels. For a while, the arrangement held. People worked, the gods rested, and everyone got fed. Then the population grew. What the tablet complains about is noise. Human beings multiplied until the sound of them rose up and never stopped, and the chief god Enlil could not sleep through it. He is described as being kept awake by the racket of a world that had got too full. Enlil's response was not to talk to anybody. He decided to reduce the number of people. His first attempt was disease. Now picture an afternoon in one of those villages. Heat sits on the roofs and does not move. Nobody is out in it. Ordinarily, there would be children somewhere and someone calling to someone else across a yard. But on this afternoon, there is nothing to hear except an insect and, further off, a dog. Sickness in a place like that moves quickly. Houses are close together. Water comes from shared channels. Families sleep 4 or 5 to a room in hot weather because the roof is cooler than inside. But it never takes everyone. Some households in the story come through. The tablet does not really explain why, and honestly neither can we, though a modern reading offers a few plausible reasons. Some people carry resistance and never know it. Some families drew from a different stretch of water. Some lived at the edge of the settlement instead of the crowded middle. A household that happened to be away from the village that season might simply have missed the whole thing. Those households are the 4th line. There is one detail in Atrahasis worth noticing, because it comes back later. A man named Atrahasis is already present in the story at this stage, and he has a god on his side. Enki, who is associated with fresh water and with cleverness, tells him what to do about the plague. The advice is essentially to redirect the offerings, to concentrate everything on the one god who controls disease, and let the others go without. It works. The sickness lifts. So the first attempt failed, and the failure was noted upstairs. Enlil had not run out of ideas. If illness would not thin them out, something slower would. A field in that country, in a year when the rain has failed, cracks into shapes. The surface goes hard and pale and splits along lines that look almost deliberate, like something drawn rather than something that happened. Step on the crust and it gives way. Underneath there is dust, and further down there is more dust, and eventually you stop digging because you already know. Enlil's second attempt was hunger. The text describes it plainly enough. Rain was held back. Fields produced white salt instead of grain. The land would not open, and nothing came up out of it. Famine in southern Mesopotamia was never a matter of one bad month. Barley goes in around autumn and is cut in spring, so a household lives roughly a year on each harvest. Miss one and there is no second chance until the next cycle comes round. Everything depends on how much you manage to put by. And here is where it gets hard, because grain in a storeroom is doing 2 different jobs at once. Part of it is food. That is obvious. The other part is next year, because the same barley in the same jar is what goes into the ground when the season turns. Grain is dinner, and grain is the future. And in a bad year, those 2 things compete directly. A hungry family with children looking at them can eat the seed. Nothing physically stops them. It is barley, it is edible, and it is sitting right there in the house. What happens next is the whole point. Eat it and you get through the winter, and then spring arrives, and there is nothing to plant. So the following year is worse than this one, and after that, there's no way back at all. The household is finished, not by the famine, but by what it did during the famine. Our fifth line is the families who did not eat it. They stayed hungry deliberately, with food in the room, because they understood what that particular jar was for. Some of them presumably lost people doing it. When the rain finally returned, they had something to put in the ground, and their fields came back while other fields stayed empty. Nobody wrote a poem about them. It is not the kind of decision that makes a good story, since it involves sitting still and refusing to do the obvious thing. But it is the reason there was anyone left to feed when the water eventually came back. Atrahasis got advice again during this one. Enki told him what to do, offerings were redirected, and the rain returned. Twice now, the plan had failed. Something else was already working on those fields, though, and it was not coming from any god. It was coming up out of the ground, and it was white, and it was patient. Walk out to a field in the evening, at the end of a hot week, and you may find it has gone white. Not everywhere. It shows up in patches, thin and powdery, sitting on top of the soil like frost that has come at the wrong time of year. Rub some between your fingers, and it feels gritty. Taste it, and you already know what it is. Salt does not arrive from anywhere. It was in the river the whole time. Water coming down from the mountains carries dissolved minerals in quantities far too small to notice. Pour that water onto a field under a hot sun, and most of it evaporates straight back into the air. What it was carrying stays behind. Do that twice a year for a decade, and the amount left in the topsoil is still trivial. Do it for 200 years, and the field starts to change. Barley tolerates salt reasonably well. Wheat does not. There are records from southern Mesopotamia that let us watch this happen, which is a rare thing to be able to say about the ancient world. Temple accounts list what was harvested and where, year after year, because grain was owed and somebody had to keep track. Read those lists in order, and the proportion of wheat falls steadily while barley climbs, until eventually the wheat disappears from certain districts altogether. Yields drop as well. Fields that had fed a town stop being worth the labor. Nobody involved understood the chemistry. What they understood was that particular ground had gone bad, and that switching crops bought time, and that a field left alone for a few seasons sometimes recovered. Our sixth line is the households that acted on it. Some of them changed what they planted, moving to barley before they were forced to. Some let a field lie idle for a year or two and farmed elsewhere, which costs you a harvest now to keep the land working later. Others gave up on their ground entirely and moved north, upriver, onto soil that had not been watered for as many centuries. Every one of those choices is unglamorous and expensive in the short term. The families that made them ended up farming when their neighbors could not. There is one more thing about salt worth knowing, and it is why this chapter sits where it does. Illness passes. Drought breaks when the rain returns. Salt does neither. It accumulates quietly over lifetimes, and the damage is already done by the time it becomes visible. A person could farm the same field their whole life and never see it change, then hand it to a son who watches it fail. Enlil had tried disease and been beaten. He had tried hunger and been beaten again. Both times, Atrahasis received a warning. Offerings were redirected, and the people came through. 3 attempts, 3 failures, and by now the noise from below was as loud as ever. At that point, according to the tablets, the plan changed. No more thinning out, no more measured reduction. What came next was meant to finish the job completely. The night before it started, the air went still. Nothing moved, not the reeds, not the water, not the dust on the paths between houses. Animals were restless in a way nobody could explain, shifting and refusing to settle. Heat that should have lifted after sunset simply stayed. Enlil had made the other gods swear an oath. None of them would tell the people what was coming. Enki had sworn along with everyone else, and he kept to the letter of it. What he did was walk up to the reed wall of a house and start talking, not to the man inside, to the wall. He addressed the reeds directly, told them a great flood was coming and that a boat needed building, and gave the measurements. Atrahasis was on the other side of that wall, listening to every word. It is a small piece of storytelling and a very clever one. The oath said nothing about speaking to a person. Enki never did. He talked to a building, and whoever happened to overhear was not his responsibility. Then came the practical problem of a man suddenly building an enormous boat in a place where everyone can see him. Enki supplied the cover story. Atrahasis was to tell his neighbors that he had fallen out with Enlil and could no longer live in the city, so he was leaving by water. That explanation is entirely believable, and it even sounds like bad news for him rather than for them. In one version, he adds a line about abundance raining down after his departure, which is true in a horrible way. Building took 7 days. Family went aboard, along with animals and grain and whatever else would be needed by people starting over. Then the door was sealed with pitch. Nobody agrees on what the boat looked like. Gilgamesh describes something rigidly geometric. Each side measures 120 cubits, and the height matches, which makes it a cube roughly 60 meters across in every direction. Inside were 7 decks, and each deck was divided into 9 sections. A vessel built to those dimensions would float technically, and would also be almost impossible to steer, though steering was never the point. Another description turned up much more recently and looks nothing like that. In 2009, a man walked into the British Museum with a small tablet his father had picked up in the Middle East after the war. It had sat in a drawer at home for decades. A curator there, Irving Finkel, read it and found 60 lines of instructions for building a survival vessel, given by a god to a man, in the usual way. The boat in those instructions is round. It is a coracle, the same basic shape as the small hide-and-frame boats that were still being used on Iraqi rivers within living memory, scaled up to something enormous. Rope is coiled in a spiral to form the base and walls. The tablet lists quantities, and the quantities are absurd. Over 500 kilometers of rope, bitumen by the ton for waterproofing, with the recipe for mixing it. A floor area of about 3,600 square meters, which works out to a diameter of roughly 70 meters. Finkel's team had a version built to test whether the design could work at all. It could, more or less, though scaling it to full size introduced problems the tablet does not address. A round boat cannot go anywhere. That may be the whole idea. Nobody in the story is trying to reach a destination, because there are no destinations left. What is needed is a thing that stays shut and stays up, and a coracle does both, and it does not care which way the current is going. Rain arrived, and it did not behave like rain. The descriptions in these texts get strange here. Wind is compared to an army. The sound is loud enough that the gods themselves become frightened of what they have started, and there is an image of them climbing upward, pressing against the highest part of the sky, like dogs against a wall. One goddess cries out that these were her people, and that she should never have agreed to it. 6 days, or 7, depending on which version you read. Then everything stopped at once, and the silence was worse than the noise had been. Atrahasis opened a hatch and looked at a world with nothing in it. Water sat flat in every direction, and the quiet on it was total. He wept, according to the text, and the reason given is simply that there was nobody left anywhere. The boat grounded on high land. Birds were sent out to test whether the water had gone down, and the last one did not come back, which meant it had found somewhere to stand. He came out and made an offering. The gods came to that smoke fast, and the tablets are blunt about why. They had been hungry. Human beings had fed them. That was the entire arrangement from the beginning, and by wiping out the people, the gods had cut off their own supply. The line about them gathering like flies is not a compliment to anyone in the scene. Enlil arrived and was furious that anybody had survived. Enki argued back. What was eventually settled was a compromise, and it is a strange one to read. Rather than promising never to do it again, the gods agreed to keep human numbers down by other means from then on. Some children would not live. Some women would not have any. Death entered the arrangement as policy. Our 7th line is the household inside that boat. They are the reason the count of 13 goes past 7. One thing should be said plainly here. This story exists in more than one version, and the man has more than one name. Atrahasis in the version we have been following, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Ziosudra in the Sumerian telling, which is the oldest of the three, and which makes him the boy from the wisdom text we looked at earlier, the one whose father lectured him about donkeys. Water went down slowly, the way flood water does. What it left behind was silt, and a country that had been wiped clean of everything people had built on it. Mud after a flood dries in stages. For the first week, it is soup, and nothing can be done with it. Then a skin forms on top that will hold a bird, but not a person. Later, the surface hardens enough to walk on, though it gives underfoot in a way that makes the ground feel untrustworthy. By the end, it is set into something pale and firm that cracks in the sun, and buried under it is everything that used to be above. Silt does not respect what was there before. Streets, walls, boundary stones, the small marks that told one family's land from another, all of it goes under a smooth layer of river mud that looks identical in every direction. The king list picks up again after the flood, and it says kingship came down a second time. Where it came down was a place called Kish. Reign lengths in this section are still long, though nothing like before, and as the list continues, they shrink toward numbers a person could actually live. Names in the later portion match up with kings we know about from other records entirely. What happened on the ground was that people went back, not somewhere new, back to the same places, the same river bends, the same slight rises in an otherwise flat country. Cities that had drowned were rebuilt directly on top of themselves, which is exactly the habit we started with in Aridu, except that this time there was a flood layer in the middle of the stack, rather than the usual rubble. Excavations at several southern sites hit that layer. A band of clean, water-laid silt, sitting between occupied levels, with pottery above it and pottery below it, and nothing at all inside it. Finding that layer was an accident, and the man who found it did not expect it. Leonard Woolley was excavating at in 1929 and had reached the bottom of the rubbish and burials that made up the occupied levels. Below those, he expected clean subsoil, meaning the ground people had first settled on. What his workmen hit instead was silt, and they kept going down through it, and it did not stop. Roughly 2.5 meters of it, laid down by water, with nothing human in it anywhere. He came out of the pit, uncertain about what he was looking at. According to the story that got told afterwards, his wife looked into the trench and said the obvious thing, which was that this was the flood. Woolley announced it in those terms, and the newspapers went enormous with it. The situation turned out to be more complicated, as it usually does. Other sites in the south have their own silt layers, and when the dates were worked out properly, they did not match each other. Ur's layer, Kish's layer, and Shurupak's layer belong to different centuries. A single event covering the whole region at one moment does not fit the evidence. What does fit is a country that flooded badly and repeatedly in different places at different times over thousands of years, on a plain so flat that a river rising by a couple of meters could drown a district the size of a county. Woolley was wrong about the specific claim and right about the general one. Something had emptied that ground and buried it, and people had come back afterwards and started again on top. Above and below, in some cases, the pottery is the same style. That detail is worth pausing over. The same style means the same people, or near enough. They did not scatter and get replaced by somebody else. Whoever came back was carrying the previous way of doing things, and simply continued. Our 8th line is the ones who went back down onto ruined ground. Rebuilding on a flood site is not an obvious decision. Everything you knew is under a meter of silt. Landmarks are gone. Fields have to be found again by memory, and disputes about who owns what must have been endless. Higher ground was available, and drier ground existed further north, and some people surely took those options and are not part of this story. The ones who came back had a reason. Marsh at the river's edge gave fish, reeds, birds, and easy water, and land that floods is land that gets a free layer of fertile silt. Ground that had just tried to kill them was also the most productive ground in the country. So they took the shovels out again and started clearing canals that had silted up and put the boundary stones back roughly where they remembered them being. What they found when they got there, though, was that the country had come out of the water changed in one specific way, and it had nothing to do with mud. People were no longer all speaking the same language. A road between two towns, on an ordinary morning, with traders coming the other way. Donkeys are loaded. Someone is walking ahead of the animals and someone else behind. Both groups stop, because that is what you do, and the usual questions get asked. What is the price of grain where you have come from? Is the crossing passable? Who is collecting taxes on this stretch now? There is a Sumerian poem that describes a time when questions like that needed no translation. It sits inside a longer text about a king of Uruk and his dealings with a distant city, and it looks back at an earlier age. In that age, the poem says, the whole world spoke to Enlil in one language. Several regions are named, spread across a large area, and all of them are described as sharing a single speech. Then something changed it, and the poem says a god was responsible. Different translations of the passage disagree, and the disagreement matters. One reading has the god deliberately putting confusion into speech, splitting a single language into many. Another reading has it the other way, with the god ending an argument and giving one language to peoples who had many. Scholars have gone back and forth on this for decades, because the wording is genuinely ambiguous and the tablet is damaged. We cannot settle it here. What can be said is that the text exists, that it is Sumerian, and that it is describing language as something that changed at a particular moment rather than something that simply is. On the ground, meanwhile, the actual situation in Mesopotamia was mixed from early on. Sumerian was spoken in the south. Akkadian, a completely unrelated language, was spoken alongside it and increasingly to the north. The two coexisted for centuries, which is why scribes were trained in both and why we have long lists matching words in one to words in the other. Eventually, Akkadian took over as the language people used day to day, and Sumerian stopped being anyone's mother tongue, but it did not disappear. Sumerian carried on for another 2,000 years as a written language. Priests used it. Scribal students learned it in school. Temple texts stayed in it long after nobody's grandmother spoke a word of it, in roughly the way Latin persisted in Europe, after Latin stopped being anybody's first language. Our ninth line is the households that held on to the older speech. Learning a dead language is not a small ask. Children had to be made to sit and do it, in a script that took years to master, for a tongue they would never hear in the street. Somebody in those families decided it was worth the trouble, and kept deciding it, generation after generation, while everyone around them got on with speaking the language of the present. Because they did, the flood story survived. So did the king list, the sages, the whole tangle of it. Every tablet George Smith read in that London museum came through those households. Speech was not the only thing that could stop, though. There was a story the Sumerians told about a time when the world above went quiet, and nothing grew in it, and nobody was born. Evening comes to a doorway, and someone kneels down to light a lamp. The lamp is a shallow clay dish with a pinched lip at one end, and a wick of twisted flax lies in the oil, with just its tip showing. Getting it going takes a while. Once the flame catches it, sits very small and very steady, and it throws just enough light to see the width of the room, which on most nights is all anybody needs. Oil for that lamp came from sesame, pressed and stored and paid for in barley, and a household that ran out of it sat in the dark until the next pressing. There is a story about a time when the light went out everywhere at once. It concerns Inanna, who was the great goddess of the south, associated with love and with war and with the planet we call Venus. For reasons the poem never fully explains, she decided to go down into the underworld, which was ruled by her older sister Ereshkigal, and was not a place anyone visited by choice. Before leaving, she gave instructions to her servant. If she failed to come back within 3 days, the servant was to go to the gods and plead for her. 7 gates stood on the way down, At each one she was made to give something up. Her crown went first, then a string of beads, then a second string, then a breastplate, then a ring, then a measuring rod, and finally the garment itself. Every gate took one more thing, and the guard's answer each time was that the ways of the underworld are perfect and are not to be questioned. She arrived in front of her sister with nothing at all, and was killed, and her body was hung on a hook. Above ground, everything stopped. The poem describes it in agricultural terms rather than emotional ones, which is what makes it land. Bulls no longer went to cows. Donkeys no longer went to jennies. Men stopped sleeping with their wives, and wives slept alone, and the whole business of one generation producing another simply ceased across the entire world. Nothing was born. Nothing was planted that came up. A world that had always turned over stayed exactly where it was. Her servant did as instructed and went from God to God, and most of them refused. Enki, who has helped in every crisis so far, worked out a solution. He made two small creatures out of the dirt under his fingernails, beings that were neither male nor female, and therefore not subject to the rules that trap the living down there. They slipped into the underworld unnoticed. Ereshkigal was in pain when they arrived, groaning like a woman in labor, and the two creatures did nothing except sympathize with her. Every time she cried out, they echoed her distress back. She was so unused to anyone caring how she felt that she offered them a gift, and they asked for the body on the hook. Inanna came back up. The bargain was that somebody had to take her place, and the one who ended up going down was her husband Dumuzi, and later an arrangement was reached where he spent half the year below, and his sister took the other half the year below, half above. That is a seasonal calendar wearing a story as a coat. Southern Iraq does not do winter the way Northern Europe does, but it has a dead season all the same. Heat in high summer runs past 50 degrees and stays there for weeks. Fields go brown. Nothing planted survives it. Livestock stop breeding. There is a long stretch every year when the country simply waits. And the poem about Inanna is one way of explaining why. There was one crop that did not care about any of this, and southern Iraq was built on it. Date palms tolerate heat that kills everything else, tolerate salty ground that has stopped growing grain, and produce for something like 60 years once established. Fruit dries hard and keeps for a long time without any special treatment. A grove also throws shade, and in that country shade is a crop of its own, because vegetables can be grown underneath palms in a hot season when open ground would burn them. Sumerian farmers understood palm pollination and did it by hand, climbing the trunks with a bundle of male flowers, because leaving it to the wind gives poor results. Carved scenes show exactly that, and the practice has not changed much since. Somebody even wrote a debate poem in which a date palm and a tamarisk tree argue about which of them is more useful to humanity. The palm lists its fruit, its fiber, its shade, and its timber. The tamarisk answers back, "Nothing is resolved," which is the standard ending for that kind of poem. And the fact that the argument was worth writing down tells you how central the tree was. A household with a grove had something to eat in the months when the fields gave nothing. Our 10th line is the households that were provisioned for it. Getting through a dead season is a matter of arithmetic done months in advance. Grain has to be sealed in jars where damp cannot reach it and rats cannot get at it. Dates need drying and packing. Oil for lamps must be pressed and set aside, and fuel gathered, because a household that burns through its oil in the first weeks is going to spend the rest of it sitting in the dark. None of this can be improvised at the point when you need it. Everything depends on decisions taken back when there was plenty by someone who was willing to put food away instead of eating it. Families that got the arithmetic right came out the other side with people still alive and stores not quite empty. Ones that got it wrong did not, and their names are not in any list. A dead season ends, though. That is the whole point of a season. Rain returns, the fields go green, and the world starts over. Some things that came to that country did not work on a cycle, and did not end, and could not be waited out. One of them showed up first as a smudge of dust along the eastern hills. Dust on the horizon behaves oddly at a distance. At first, it is easy to mistake for haze, the kind that sits over the hills on any hot afternoon. Watch it for an hour and it has grown taller. By evening it has moved, and by then whoever is watching has usually worked out that haze does not travel in a straight line. Mountains rise to the east of Mesopotamia, and out of them came people the Sumerians, called the Gutians. Almost nothing is known about them, which is worth admitting straight away. Their language has not survived in any usable form. No monuments of theirs are standing anywhere. Practically everything written about them comes from the people they conquered, which is not the most reliable source of information about anybody. What the tablets do is describe them as weather. A long poem called The Curse of Agade tells the story, and the imagery in it is meteorological from beginning to end. Enlil is angry with the city of Akkad, and what he brings down from the hills is described as a storm rather than an army. The Gutians in that text are compared to swarms, to something that moves across a landscape without shape or purpose, and the poem says they came down in numbers nobody could count. Akkad had been the center of an empire. Sargon built it, and his grandson Naram-Sin ruled it at its height, and for a while controlled more territory than anything the region had seen before. Then it stopped existing. The city of Akkad has never been found. Archaeologists have been looking for it for well over a century, and it is one of very few capitals of a major empire whose location remains completely unknown. Somewhere under a mound in central Iraq, there is presumably a palace, and nobody can say which mound. Modern research has added something the poem could not have known. Cores drilled out of the seafloor and out of lake beds show a sharp, dry period beginning around 2200 BC, lasting a couple of centuries, affecting a wide stretch of the Near East. Dust levels in those cores jump. Rainfall drops. Settlements in the north of Mesopotamia, which depended on rain rather than rivers, were abandoned in large numbers at exactly that time. Whether that drought caused the collapse is argued about, and reasonable people land on different sides of it. But something made a lot of northerners leave, and southern cities in the same period show sudden growth in population that has to have come from somewhere. Our 11th line went into the marshes. Marshland is poor country by most measures, and it was still the safest place in Mesopotamia when things went wrong. Channels wander and shift. Water sits at unpredictable depths. A person who grew up there can move through it in a small boat and be gone from sight in under a minute. And a person who did not is going to get lost. And an army with animals and supplies cannot follow at all. Fish were there. Birds, reeds, buffalo later on. And enough to eat if you knew what you were doing. Marsh people in southern Iraq lived that way into the 20th century. In reed houses built on floating islands of packed reed, which is the same technique described at the very start of this story. Every regime that ever wanted to control them found it difficult. The wetlands were drained deliberately in the 1990s to force the issue, and some of them have since been reflooded. Whoever went into the water and waded did not leave any record of having done it. That is more or less the nature of hiding. All that can be said is that the Gutian period ended after roughly a century. Cities in the south came back under local rule, and there were still Sumerian speakers and Sumerian scribes when it was over, which means somebody had been somewhere in the meantime. Cities recovered. A dynasty at took control and ran the most tightly organized state the region had produced, with tens of thousands of administrative tablets recording deliveries of grain and sheep and reed bundles down to the individual item. That state lasted a little over a century. What ended it was not weather. An empty street holds sound differently. Wind moving down a lane between mud brick walls makes a low noise, and there is nothing to interrupt it. Doorways stand open because nobody closed them. Grain that spilled on the way out is still lying where it fell, and after a season the dust has half covered it. Fell in about 2004 BC. The end of it was slow and mostly bureaucratic, which is not how anybody expects a civilization to finish. Administrative tablets from the last years show the system failing in stages. Grain prices in the records climbed to many times what they had been. Deliveries that were meant to arrive from outlying provinces stop appearing. Officials in distant cities quietly begin dating documents by their own reigns instead of the king's, which is a polite way of announcing that they no longer take orders. An army from Elam, to the east, arrived at the end and took the city. The last king was carried off, and the tablets say he was taken away in fetters, and nothing further is recorded about what became of him. Then something remarkable happened, and it is the reason this chapter exists. Somebody sat down and wrote a poem about it. The text is called The Lament for Ur, and it is long, and it is one of the strangest documents to come out of the ancient world. What it does is treat a city as a person who has been abandoned. The goddess Ningal, who belonged to Ur, is described weeping over the place and pleading with the other gods to reverse the decision, and being refused because the decision had already been made in council and could not be unmade. Images in it are domestic rather than military. Sheep pens standing empty with the wind blowing through them, rivers where no boats travel, streets where the dead lie unburied because there is nobody left to bury them. The goddess describes her own house as a place she can no longer bear to look at. Something in it refuses to make sense of what happened. There is no argument that the city deserved it. No lesson drawn, no consolation offered at the end. Grief is set down and left as grief. Whoever wrote that was not running. Our 12th line is the scribes who stayed and recorded the fall of their own city while it was still smoking. Consider what the work involved. Clay had to be prepared, and it dries within an hour, so the composition could not be done at leisure. A stylus was needed, and a place to sit, and enough light. Writing at that level took a decade of training. The person doing it had been through the school, had learned the old language, and knew precisely how much labor a text of that length represented. They could have left. Plenty did. What that person chose instead was to spend days recording the worst thing that had ever happened to them in a city that had just been sacked. For readers they would never meet. Laments became a genre after that. Other cities got their own. The form was still being copied centuries later, and eventually it was used in temple ritual, performed on occasions when a building was being torn down and rebuilt, so that nothing would be destroyed without somebody mourning it properly. There is one further thing about the lament for Ur that ought to be said. We do not have the original. Not a single tablet written during or immediately after the fall of the city has come down to us. Every copy that exists was made later, by students in schools as an exercise. The text survived because generations of children were handed a lump of clay and told to reproduce it, and their teachers checked the work, and the tablets that got thrown away ended up in rubbish pits, where archaeologists eventually dug them out. Somebody wrote it, then somebody copied it, and then somebody copied that. The last of the 13 is not a family, and it never was. Sumerian schools were called the tablet house, and the training in them was long and repetitive, and judging by the texts the students themselves left behind, thoroughly unpleasant. Boys arrived young. Days were spent copying, and then copying again, and being caned for errors. And there is a well-known composition in which a student describes being beaten by the man in charge of the yard, the man in charge of silence, and his own teacher, all in the same day, for various small failures. What they copied were the old texts. Word lists first, thousands of them, learned by rote, proverbs after that. Then the long compositions, the hymns and the laments and the stories, in a language that had not been spoken in ordinary conversation for centuries by the time most of them sat down to learn it. Nobody in those rooms was trying to preserve anything. They were trying to qualify for a job in an administration that required scribes who could handle the traditional material. But an entire civilization came through anyway, carried by children doing homework badly. Sumerian outlasted the Sumerians by roughly 2,000 years in that form. It was still being taught when the Assyrian Empire was at its height. Ashurbanipal, who ruled from Nineveh in the 7th century BC, and who took an unusual personal interest in the matter, sent people out across his territory to collect tablets and copy them, and built a library that held tens of thousands. That library burned when Nineveh fell in 612 BC. Fire is what saved it. Clay that has been baked in a burning building becomes hard and stable and effectively permanent, and the tablets that would otherwise have crumbled were fired in place by the destruction of the room they sat in. Under the collapsed ceiling, in the ash, they simply waited. 25 centuries later, a dig cleared that mound and found them, and the crates were shipped to London, and they sat unread because hardly anyone alive could make out the script. Reading that script again was a job that took most of a century, and it started on the side of a cliff in western Iran. There's an inscription up there called Behistun, carved on the orders of Darius, a Persian king, around 520 BC. He had it cut about 100 meters above the ground, on a rock face with the approach deliberately destroyed afterwards so nobody could get near it. What he wanted was for the thing to be seen and not touched. The same text appears 3 times in 3 different languages, which was normal for that empire and turned out to be the luckiest accident in the history of the subject. Henry Rawlinson, an army officer stationed in the region, decided to copy it. The method involved ropes, ladders propped at angles that would horrify anybody now, and a good deal of hanging off a ledge with a notebook. Sections he could not reach were eventually squeezed onto wet paper by a local boy who was small enough to work along the narrow parts of the face. Rawlinson did this over several years, in stages, between his actual duties. One of the 3 languages was Old Persian, and it was the simplest, and it was cracked first. Once that version could be read, it functioned as a key. Scholars now had a text they understood sitting beside the same text in a script they did not, which is precisely the situation that makes decipherment possible. Progress on the 3rd language, which was the Mesopotamian one, was slow and heavily disputed. Plenty of people thought the whole effort was self-deception. So in 1857, a test was arranged. A newly found inscription that nobody had published was sent to 4 scholars separately, and each of them was asked to produce a translation without consulting the others. The 4 results came back and were opened in front of witnesses. They agreed closely enough that the argument was effectively finished. Everything after that depended on a soldier on a rope with a notebook. Then a banknote engraver started spending his lunch breaks in front of the cases. So the count runs like this: reed keepers who would not move off their own ruins, families claiming descent from 7 teachers out of the sea, names on a list of kings whose reigns run to tens of thousands of years, households that the sickness passed over, people who stayed hungry with seed grain in the room, farmers who read the white crust and changed what they planted, 1 boatload worn through a wall, those who came back down onto silt and started clearing canals, speakers of a language nobody needed, households provisioned for the season when nothing grows, the ones who went into the marsh and were not followed, scribes who wrote down the end of their own city instead of running from it, and students copying badly for 2,000 years. Smith read the flood tablet in 1872 and went back for more. The museum sent him out to Nineveh to look for missing pieces, and he found some, which is an absurd piece of luck. He made a 3rd trip in 1876. On the way home, he became ill somewhere in Syria and died there at 36. His tablets are in the museum still. Some are on display, and most are not, because there are far too many, and the ones that are not sit in drawers in the study rooms upstairs. Wooden drawers, in cabinets, in rows. Each tablet has a number written on a small label. A researcher can request one, and it will be brought out and put on a foam cradle on a table by the window and read, and then taken back. The clay is still there. It sits in a drawer, in a room where the lights are off, and nobody comes in at night.